The bitter Chicago wind cut through the pre-dawn darkness like shards of glass, and Rosa Delgado clutched her threadbare scarf tighter as she hurried through the wrought-iron gates of the Ashford estate. 7 minutes late. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she fumbled with trembling fingers for the servant's entrance key, knowing that Christopher Ashford valued punctuality above compassion, efficiency above empathy. For nearly 3 years, Rosa had been the shadow that kept his world immaculate. She polished mahogany surfaces until they reflected like mirrors, arranged fresh peonies in imported crystal vases, and ensured that every corner of his Gold Coast mansion spoke of his success. In return, he acknowledged her existence only when something wasn't perfect, referring to her as the cleaning lady when he bothered to speak of her at all. Christopher Ashford was Chicago's most ruthless property developer, a man who could transform entire neighborhoods with the stroke of a pen and the deployment of demolition crews. His Georgian-style mansion overlooked Lake Michigan, its tall windows like judgmental eyes surveying a city he'd helped reshape according to his vision of progress. Inside, everything was calculated perfection, from the imported Italian marble floors to the climate-controlled art collection, where Rosa sometimes paused to appreciate beauty she'd never be able to afford. That January morning, as a blizzard turned the world into a whirling mass of white chaos, Rosa's exhaustion showed in every careful step she took up the icy service stairs. She'd spent the entire night at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, holding her father's weathered hand as his emphysema worsened. Papa Miguel's medical bills were drowning her slowly, one prescription at a time, one specialist visit after another. The migraine that had been building behind her eyes since midnight pulsed with each heartbeat. She'd taken 3 buses to get here after her ancient Honda finally died in the hospital parking lot, leaving her stranded with nothing but bus fare and desperate prayers. "You're late." Christopher's voice sliced through the warm foyer air without him even looking up from his tablet. He stood in his perfectly pressed charcoal suit, already preparing for a day of meetings that would reshape someone else's neighborhood. Rosa's throat constricted. "Mr. Ashford, I apologize. My father, I don't need a story." He finally looked at her, his steel-gray eyes as cold and unforgiving as the lake wind outside. "This is unacceptable. I have investors arriving this afternoon, and I can't have unreliable staff." The words struck her like physical blows. Rosa had never been late without cause: a sick father, broken public transportation, or the part-time evening job cleaning medical offices that she worked to supplement her meager income. But Christopher Ashford had never asked about her life. "Beyond these pristine walls. Sir, if I could just explain—" "There's nothing to explain. You're terminated. Effective immediately." The silence that followed felt like falling into an abyss. Rosa watched her future crumble in real time, her carefully constructed life of juggling responsibilities suddenly collapsing like a house of cards. She straightened her shoulders, preserving what dignity she could manage. "I understand. I'll collect my belongings." Christopher was already walking toward his home office, his handmade Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with military precision. "Security will see you out in 15 minutes. Leave your keys on the kitchen counter." Rosa didn't tell him that her only belongings were a spare uniform and a worn paperback novel in her locker. She didn't mention the narrow cot she'd been sleeping on in the storage closet near the laundry room, or how she'd been sending nearly every paycheck to the hospital to keep her father alive and her younger sister Maria in community college. She didn't explain that his mansion had become her sanctuary after losing her studio apartment 8 months ago to medical debt. Instead, she walked out into the howling blizzard with nothing but $17 in her worn purse and the clothes on her back. Chicago streets stretched before her like a frozen wasteland. The snow was falling so heavily that the familiar landmarks disappeared into white oblivion. Rosa walked for hours, her feet growing numb in her discount sneakers, until exhaustion and hypothermia began clouding her judgment. She found herself in Millennium Park, where the Crown Fountain stood silent and the bean reflected nothing but swirling snow. She collapsed onto a bench near the pavilion, telling herself it was just temporary. Just until the storm passed. Just until she could think clearly enough to figure out her next move. The Salvation Army shelter was full. She'd called from a payphone with her last quarter, and every other resource was either closed or overwhelmed by the winter emergency. Her sister Maria was barely managing in her tiny dorm room, working 2 jobs to pay for classes. Her father was unconscious in the ICU, fighting for each breath. Rosa had nowhere to turn, no safety net to catch her fall. As the afternoon dissolved into evening and the temperature plummeted further, exhaustion pulled at Rosa's consciousness, like an undertow. The falling snow began to muffle the sounds of the city, creating a strange, peaceful silence that felt dangerously inviting. She curled deeper into her thin coat, her body instinctively trying to preserve whatever warmth remained. Just for a few minutes, she whispered to herself, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Just until I can feel my feet again. Her eyes grew heavy, despite her best efforts to stay alert. The cold was making her drowsy, a warning, sign she was too tired to recognize. Across the city, Christopher Ashford's evening was unraveling in its own way. His regular driver had called in sick with flu, leaving him stranded at his office building in the loop. The blizzard had shut down most transportation, but his dinner meeting with Tokyo investors was too crucial to cancel. The restaurant was only 12 blocks away, a walk that would normally take 15 minutes but could take an hour in these conditions. Christopher despised walking among what he called street-level humanity. Sidewalks, in his philosophy, were for people who hadn't yet figured out how to elevate themselves above the masses. But here he was, bundled in his $3,000 cashmere coat, navigating the same snow-covered streets where his construction crews had demolished old neighborhoods to build his glass towers. The blizzard had transformed familiar Chicago into an alien landscape. As he struggled through the knee-deep snowdrifts near Millennium Park, his eyes swept over the few hardy souls still braving the storm. A homeless man pushing a shopping cart, a couple hurrying toward the L station, and a small figure huddled, motionless on a bench near the pavilion. He almost walked past without a second thought. Almost. Something made him pause. Perhaps the familiar navy blue of a uniform visible beneath the snow accumulation, or the way the woman's petite frame seemed to be surrendering to the cold. Christopher took a cautious step closer, then another, his heart beginning to race as recognition dawned like a punch to the gut. "Rosa?" The name emerged from his lips as a strangled whisper. She didn't respond. Couldn't respond. When he reached out with his leather-gloved hand to brush snow from her shoulder, she was frighteningly still, her skin cold as marble, her breathing so shallow it was nearly imperceptible. Snow had begun to accumulate in her dark hair like premature gray. Auntie. Panic that seized Christopher was unlike anything in his controlled, calculated existence. This wasn't the manageable stress of a difficult negotiation or a market downturn. This was pure, primal terror. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, nearly dropping it in the snow. "Wevin, I need an ambulance at Millennium Park immediately." "There's a woman. She's unconscious. Severe hypothermia. Please, you have to hurry." He didn't disconnect the call. Instead, he shrugged out of his expensive coat without hesitation, wrapping it around Rosa's still form. He sat beside her on the snow-covered bench, pulling her against his chest, feeling for the flutter of her heartbeat beneath layers of cold clothing. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her snow-white hair, his voice breaking with emotions he'd buried for decades. "God, Rosa, I'm so sorry. Please don't die. Please." He stayed there, holding her against the storm until the paramedics arrived 18 minutes later, 18 minutes that felt like 18 hours. As they loaded her onto the stretcher, wrapping her in warming blankets and starting IV lines, Christopher followed without question, abandoning his crucial dinner meeting without a second thought. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Christopher paced the emergency waiting room like a man possessed, his $1,000 suit disheveled, his usually perfect hair wild from the wind. Nurses and doctors moved around him with practiced efficiency, but all he could think about was Rosa's pale, still face disappearing behind the trauma room doors. She would have died, Dr. Sarah Chen told him after what felt like an eternity. Core body temperature was down to 86 degrees, another 20 minutes outside, and the hypothermia would have been fatal. Christopher sank into a plastic waiting room chair, the weight of those words crushing down on him like a collapsed building. He had built an empire that reached into the clouds, but he'd nearly let a woman die on a park bench because he'd been too blind to see her as anything more than a service provider. Rosa drifted between consciousness and dreams for 3 days, her body slowly warming back to life under heated blankets and careful medical attention. When she finally opened her eyes fully, the first thing she saw was Christopher Ashford, slumped, in the bedside chair, his designer suit wrinkled beyond recognition, his face pale with exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like grief. "Am I dead?" she asked, her voice barely audible through her dry throat. "No," he said, leaning forward immediately, his eyes bright with relief. "You're alive. You're going to be okay." Rosa studied his face with confusion, searching for some explanation for his presence. The Christopher Ashford she knew didn't do hospital vigils or show genuine emotion. "Why are you here?" Christopher was quiet for a long moment, grappling with words he'd never learned to say. "Because I nearly killed you," he said finally, his voice raw with honesty. "Because I fired you into a blizzard without asking why you were late, without caring where you'd go, without seeing you as a human being who deserved basic compassion." Tears gathered in Rosa's eyes, not from sadness, but from the shock of being acknowledged as someone worth caring about. "I wasn't late on purpose," she whispered. "My father had another episode. His breathing got so bad they had to intubate him. I stayed all night because the doctor said he might not make it." Christopher felt something fundamental break open in his chest, a dam bursting after decades of emotional drought. "I never asked," he said simply. "I should have asked. I should have cared enough to ask." "My car died in the hospital parking lot," Rosa continued, the words spilling out now. "I took 3 buses to get to work, and the last one broke down. I ran the final 6 blocks through the snow because I couldn't afford to lose this job. My father's medical bills, my sister's tuition, everything depends on that paycheck." Each revelation hit Christopher like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had literally run through a blizzard to serve him, and he'd destroyed her life over 7 minutes. "Where have you been living?" he asked quietly, though he suspected he knew the answer. Rosa looked away, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "The storage room near the laundry. You have so much space, and I just needed somewhere warm and safe. I've been saving every penny for medical bills." Christopher closed his eyes, the full weight of his blindness finally crushing down on him. "Jesus, Rosa, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." He didn't leave her side that night, or the next, or the one after that. When the nurses offered him a cot, he refused, content to maintain his vigil from the uncomfortable plastic chair. He brought her books from the hospital gift shop, containers of real food to supplement the hospital's institutional offerings, and most importantly, updates on her father's condition, which he'd taken the liberty of ensuring was being handled by the city's most respected pulmonologists, with all bills sent directly to his office. "You don't have to do this," Rosa told him on the 4th day, when she was strong enough to sit up and eat solid food. "I know," Christopher replied, adjusting the flowers he'd brought. Simple daisies, not the expensive orchids that usually decorated his home. "But I want to, if you'll let me try to make this right." When Rosa was discharged a week later, Christopher was waiting in the lobby with a warm winter coat, insulated boots that actually fit, and an offer that would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. "I'm not asking you to come back as my housekeeper," he said as they stood outside the hospital entrance, snow still falling gently around them. "I'm asking you to come stay in the guest cottage on my property while you recover, while you figure out what you want to do next. No obligations, no expectations, just a safe place to heal. Rosa wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to protect what remained of her pride. But the truth was that she had nowhere else to go. Winter was far from over, and her father needed her to be strong enough to fight for his care. She nodded slowly, grateful beyond words. The guest cottage behind the Ashford estate was like stepping into a different world. Built of warm brick with climbing ivy, it featured a working fireplace, a fully equipped kitchen, and windows that looked out over gardens that would bloom with spring's arrival. Christopher had thoughtfully stocked the refrigerator with fresh ingredients and the pantry with the Mexican spices Rosa had mentioned loving during one of their late-night hospital conversations. But more than the physical comfort was the psychological space to breathe, to process trauma, to remember who she was beyond survival mode. Rosa's father began recovering slowly in his private room, and her sister Maria visited every weekend, amazed by the transformation in both Rosa and the man who had once seemed carved from ice. "I used to think wealthy people had life figured out," Christopher admitted one evening as they sat by the cottage fireplace, sharing a pot of the Mexican hot chocolate Rosa had made using her grandmother's recipe. "People like me?" Rosa asked, raising an eyebrow with a slight smile. "People who endure hardship with grace, people who sacrifice for family without complaint. I thought if you weren't protesting or demanding more, you must be content with less." Rosa smiled sadly, stirring her hot chocolate thoughtfully. "Sometimes silence is the only dignity poor people get to keep. Complaining gets you labeled as ungrateful or difficult." Christopher nodded, understanding flooding his features like dawn breaking over Lake Michigan. "I see that now. I see a lot of things differently now." As the weeks passed and Rosa grew stronger, she began observing the household staff with new eyes, the eyes of someone who had lived on both sides of the equation. She noticed the exhaustion lines around the gardener's eyes, the way the night security guard's hands shook from too much caffeine and too little sleep, the tears the elderly cook tried to hide when she thought no one was looking. Rosa started keeping detailed notes, not to cause trouble, but to understand the ecosystem of exploitation that had been hiding in plain sight. Workers pulling double shifts without overtime pay. Housekeepers expected to use their own transportation for supply runs. Maintenance staff afraid to report safety violations for fear of being labeled troublemakers. When she showed her careful documentation to Christopher, his reaction exceeded her highest hopes. "How did I miss all of this?" he asked, studying page after page of her observations. "How did I build a business and not see that I was perpetuating the same kind of blindness that nearly killed you?" "Because seeing would have required caring," Rosa said gently but honestly. "And caring about workers as people, not just as functions, wasn't part of your business model." That conversation led to a longer one in Christopher's mahogany-paneled study. Surrounded by law books and framed photographs of his various developments, he offered her a position that would have seemed impossible just months before. Director of Worker Advocacy and Ethical Employment for Ashford Development, with a salary that made her gasp, comprehensive benefits, and the authority to implement systemic changes across all his properties. "You want me to police how you treat employees?" Rosa asked, hardly believing what she was hearing. Christopher looked directly into her eyes, his gaze steady and sincere. "I want you to teach me and my company how to treat employees like human beings. I've never trusted anyone with anything more important." Rosa accepted the position with the fervor of someone who understood both sides of the power dynamic intimately. Her first initiative was a comprehensive audit of all Ashford properties, not just the prestigious developments, but the office buildings, retail spaces, and residential complexes where hundreds of people worked in various capacities. She traveled from the luxury high-rises in River North to the converted warehouses in Pilsen, meeting with employees one-on-one, asking questions no executive had ever bothered to ask. "Do you feel safe reporting problems? Do you understand your benefits? What would make your work environment better? Can you afford to live in this city on what we pay you? The stories that emerged broke Rosa's heart and strengthened her resolve simultaneously. A janitor who hadn't received a raise in 4 years despite exemplary performance reviews. A landscaping crew working without proper safety equipment to save money. A security guard who'd been hiding a workplace injury because he couldn't afford to miss shifts while it healed. Rosa didn't just document problems, she created solutions. She established anonymous reporting systems, implemented regular safety training, and worked with Christopher to restructure pay scales to reflect the actual cost of living in Chicago. She hired victim advocates, set up emergency assistance funds, and most importantly, created pathways for workers to advance within the company based on merit and training rather than connections. Christopher supported every initiative, attending monthly staff meetings where he sat at round tables instead of behind imposing desks, learning employees' names, asking about their families and career goals. The transformation was remarkable, not just in company culture, but in the man himself. 8 months after that winter night in Millennium Park, Christopher organized a fundraising gala for Chicago's Homeless Services Coalition. The grand ballroom of his estate had been transformed with Rosa's input, creating an atmosphere of warmth and welcome rather than intimidating opulence. Rosa stood beside him as his equal, not his employee, wearing a dress the color of deep emerald that brought out the strength in her dark eyes. When Christopher took the microphone to address the crowd of Chicago's business and social elite, his words carried a weight that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. "I've spent 15 years building upward and outward," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I measured success by the height of my buildings and the size of my profit margins. But I was wrong about what it means to build something lasting." He turned toward Rosa, who stood with quiet confidence beside the podium. "I'd like you to meet the woman who taught me that real construction starts with seeing the people who make our success possible. Someone who survived when the world ignored her, who kept working when the system failed her, and who chose to help others even after having every reason to walk away from people like me." The applause was thunderous as Rosa approached the microphone. When she spoke, her words carried the authority of lived experience. "I used to think power meant having control over your own life," she said, her voice reaching every corner of the room. "But real power is using whatever influence you have to make sure other people don't have to choose between dignity and survival." She paused, looking out over faces that had once been as invisible to her as she had been to them. "No one should have to sleep on a park bench for anyone to notice they're human. We can do better than that. We have to do better than that." After the gala, as they stood on the mansion's terrace overlooking Lake Michigan, Christopher and Rosa reflected on the distance they'd both traveled from that January night. "Do you ever regret it?" Christopher asked. "Not the job. I mean, giving someone like me a chance to change. Someone who had to watch you nearly die before he learned basic human decency." Rosa considered the question, watching the lights of the city reflect on the dark water like fallen stars. "I don't regret believing in people's capacity to grow," she said finally. "But I'll never forget what it cost to teach that lesson." Christopher nodded, understanding that some scars serve as permanent reminders of prices that should never have had to be paid. 18 months later, Rosa stood before a Senate subcommittee on labor rights, sharing her story with lawmakers from across the country. The Dignity at Work initiative had spread to over 100 companies nationwide, creating ripples of change that reached far beyond Chicago's skyline. "We don't just need more regulations," she told the assembled senators and representatives. "We need more employers willing to see their workers as complete human beings, to ask the important questions before someone ends up fighting for their life in an emergency room." That evening, she returned to Millennium Park alone. The Crown Fountain was flowing again, children playing in the spray despite the cool air. A small memorial plaque had been added to the bench where Christopher found her, reading simply, "In honor of all those who work in the shadows, may we learn to see them in the light." Rosa sat on the bench, not from exhaustion this time, but from choice. She closed her eyes and listened to the fountain, to the city sounds, to the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt from ashes and determination. In her briefcase was a folder full of letters from workers across the country who had heard her story and reached out. Maria, a hotel housekeeper in Phoenix who finally felt safe reporting unsafe working conditions. James, a security guard in Detroit who used the company's new education benefits to finish his degree. Patricia, a landscaper in Portland who became the first woman supervisor in her company's history. Ms. Delgado, one letter read, "You saw us when we couldn't see ourselves. Now we're helping others do the same. Thank you for showing us that survival can become service." Rosa smiled, no longer fighting tears that came from gratitude rather than grief. This was how healing worked, not as a destination, but as a journey that others could follow, a path from invisibility to influence. As she walked back through the city streets, Rosa passed dozens of other invisible workers, the window washers, on skyscraper scaffolding, the night shift nurses heading to work, the early morning food vendors preparing for the day ahead. She made eye contact when she could, offered genuine smiles, said thank you, and meant it. Small gestures, perhaps. But Rosa Delgado knew better than most that sometimes the smallest acts of recognition could literally save a life. Tomorrow, she would return to her office, with her name on the door and her family photos on the desk. She would field calls from other cities wanting to implement worker advocacy programs, respond to emails from employees finding their voices for the first time, and continue the patient, persistent work of making the invisible visible. But tonight, she was simply a woman walking home through a city that had once forgotten her, carrying within herself the hard-won knowledge that dignity was not a privilege to be earned but a right to be protected. The millionaire who had once discarded her without a second thought now walked beside her in spirit, both of them forever changed by one winter night, when humanity finally opened its eyes wide enough to see what had always been there. In the end, Rosa Delgado's story wasn't about charity or pity. It was about the revolutionary act of seeing another person completely, courageously, consistently. It was about second chances and the courage to change, about how one person's near death could become everyone's awakening to life. And somewhere in Chicago, in boardrooms and break rooms, on construction sites and in office buildings, the ripples continued to spread, one invisible worker becoming visible at a time, one act of dignity restoring faith in humanity's capacity to choose compassion over convenience.